appalling what are effectively industrial injuries afflicted a lot of the cabin crew on this flight. They were serving breakfast, and I think we might see different ways of working. And since the entire purpose of the cabin crew, their main job is to help passengers evacuate in the event of an emergency, if some of those are injured very sadly by this tragic event, are they going to be able to do that? So there will be, the investigators are already on the scene in Bangkok looking at the aircraft, and I think there will be a very long, very thorough investigation. And always, as always with aviation safety, one tragedy will lead to lessons being learned which can try to avoid them in the future.
We'll carry on the story about the planes, actually, because we've had the experience of a man on it, which was really beautifully told and takes you right into that plane when all that turbulence happened. Dozens of people are still in hospital, and one man has died. He was Geoffrey Kitchen, a 73-year-old musical theatre director from near Bristol. Let's talk about what this means for people. You might be getting on a plane today or in the next few days. Let's speak to the travel correspondent, Simon Calder. Morning to you, Simon.
Good morning. Yes, and I think an awful lot of people will be thinking, oh, crikey, I will keep my seatbelt, well, not just loosely fastened, tightly fastened on my next flight. And if something comes out of this terrible tragedy, then that will at least mean that people in future might be safer. Really interesting listening to you and Asma talking about how people tend not to listen to the safety briefing. They tend to kind of ignore what they're told because aviation is so incredibly safe. But clearly we need to be more focused on what's happening inside the cabin, because ultimately, well, last year we saw no passenger jets in scheduled service crashing at all, which is frankly miraculous. And now attention, I think, is going to switch to, well, how can we keep people safer inside the cabin? And a whole lot of issues have been revealed by this awful incident.
How common is this then Simon? Because turbulence is a word that everyone is familiar with. It's not actually a very common word in any other context. So people are cognizant of the notion of what it is. But have you ever heard of it being this bad? How often does that happen?
Well, you get a severe bit of turbulence about 800 times a year involving scheduled flights where people are badly hurt enough for there to be a kind of accident report. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Seoul in Korea. On my flight coming over here, we hit a sudden piece of turbulence just close to Beijing in China. Now, unlike the Singapore Airlines flight, there weren't people moving around the cabin. They weren't serving breakfast or anything. There was one passenger who was hurt badly enough that they had to appeal for medical assistance on board the aircraft. They found that and she was okay. But ultimately, about twice a day on average, you are going to get some severe turbulence. It's a combination of turbulence you kind of might know about because it's in tropical areas, particularly in areas where there's high convectivity, but also clear air turbulence, which is by far the more dangerous type. You can't see it on weather radar. Suddenly you are caught in an updraft or a downdraft, and we saw the appalling pictures. So you can see them on times online of the interior of that aircraft. Really awful, and particularly to think that a lot of the ceiling panels were damaged by people who were literally just lifted upwards, or rather the aircraft descended very quickly and they stayed at the same altitude. Awful. And
were you worried, Simon? I mean, are you worried? Is this? I mean, do you think this will have an impact on people? I mean, the obvious impact will be, and you made that point already, but it's worth reiterating, is wear the seatbelt when you're told to wear the seatbelt, because things like this can happen. Do you feel any more concern when you're getting on a plane, or is it actually business as usual?
I just look at the numbers. I mean, I'm flying from here tomorrow, and I will make sure, as I always do, that I keep my seatbelt fastened. And that, I think, it is going to be really interesting to see whether there are changes of policy, because at the moment, of course, you get the briefing from the pilot and he or she will typically say, okay, we advise you keep your seatbelt loosely fastened. Now, one or two pilots I've been speaking to overnight have said, no, make sure your seatbelt's done up. Just imagine you're in a car. You wouldn't drive around without a seatbelt on.
Yeah.
Don't fly around without the seatbelt on, apart from when you've got to get up, perhaps to stretch your legs or use the washroom or whatever. And I think we might see some airlines actually coming up with that as a standard policy, so everybody will be expected to have their seatbelt on all the time, except when they are having to use the loo or whatever.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think we might see some effects on the way that cabin crew work, because appalling what are effectively industrial injuries afflicted a lot of the cabin crew on this flight. They were serving breakfast, and I think we might see different ways of working. And since the entire purpose of the cabin crew, their main job is to help passengers evacuate in the event of an emergency, if some of those are injured, very sadly, by this tragic event, are they going to be able to do that? So there will be, the investigators are already on the scene in Bangkok looking at the aircraft, and I think there will be a very long, very thorough investigation. And always, as always with aviation safety, one tragedy will lead to lessons being learned which can try to avoid them in the future.
Yeah. Great point, Simon. As ever, good to speak to you. Safe journey home, Simon.
Thank you.
As Simon Calder there, the travel correspondent. Blake got in touch, says, air crew myself for nearly 36 years. The airline I work for recommends keeping your seatbelt fastened at all times, as I'm sure Singapore Airlines do. It's remarkable how customers completely ignore the seatbelt signs in flight, even when turbulence is expected and they are on. I had a similar incident to this over 30 years ago on a flight from the Caribbean. It can happen.